The knock came at 5:47 a.m., and I knew, somehow, I just knew that whoever was standing on my porch in the freezing December darkness would change everything. My name is Margaret, and at 73 years old, I've learned to trust my instincts. They told me not to answer that door. They told me that decent people don't show up before dawn, especially not in a neighborhood like mine where the streetlights have been broken for months and hope died even longer ago. But something about that knock. It wasn't aggressive like the bill collectors who'd been haunting my doorstep. It wasn't the sharp, demanding rap of someone who wanted to take something from me. This was different, gentle, almost apologetic. I shuffled to the window in my tattered robe, my arthritis screaming with every step on the ice-cold hardwood floors. The heating had been shut off 3 days ago. Through the frost-covered glass, I could barely make out a figure, tall, wearing what looked like an expensive coat that seemed completely out of place in this forgotten corner of Detroit. Here's what I should tell you about that moment. I had $8.73 in my checking account, a foreclosure notice that would become final in 6 days, and I hadn't eaten a real meal in 36 hours. My own children hadn't returned my calls in weeks. I was invisible to the world, just another old woman the system had chewed up and forgotten. But when I opened that door and saw his face, those strange, knowing eyes that seemed to see straight through to my soul, I realized I'd been wrong about being invisible. Someone had been watching. Someone had been waiting. "Ma'am," he said, his breath forming clouds in the brutal cold, "I'm sorry to bother you so early, but I wonder, could you spare something warm? I've been walking all night," and he paused, tilting his head like he was listening to something I couldn't hear. "I had a feeling you might understand what it means to be hungry." That's when I noticed his hands. No gloves, but no signs of frostbite either, despite the fact that it was 12 degrees below zero. And his shoes, polished leather Oxfords that should have been ruined by the slush and ice, but somehow looked like he'd just stepped out of a boardroom. I should have closed the door. Every rational part of my brain was screaming at me to lock it, call someone, hide. Instead, I heard myself saying, "Come in before you freeze to death." What I didn't know was that he already knew my name. He knew about the foreclosure notice on my kitchen table, about my empty pantry, about the way I cried myself to sleep every night, wondering if tomorrow would be the day I'd have to leave the only home I'd known for 47 years. And most terrifying of all, he knew exactly why he'd chosen me. The story I'm about to tell you isn't just about a stranger who paid off my mortgage. It's about what happened when I discovered who he really was, why he'd been looking for me specifically, and the impossible choice he offered me that cold December morning. It's about the price of kindness, the weight of secrets, and the thin line between miracles and nightmares. Because some strangers aren't strangers at all. Some are exactly who they're supposed to be, arriving exactly when they're supposed to arrive, carrying gifts that will either save you or destroy everything you thought you knew about your own life. If you're ready to discover the truth about what really happened in those 10 days that followed, and why I sometimes wake up at 3 a.m. wondering if I made the right choice, then stay with me. Hit that like button if you believe that some stories need to be told, no matter how impossible they sound. And subscribe, because what I'm about to share with you over the next 10 chapters will challenge everything you think you know about fate, family, and the strangers who walk among us. Trust me when I tell you, you're not ready for what comes next. The stranger's presence filled my tiny kitchen like smoke, thick and suffocating. I watched him wrap his long fingers around the chipped ceramic mug, steam rising between us like a barrier I couldn't cross back over. His eyes never left mine, and there was something in that steady gaze that made my skin crawl. Not fear exactly, but recognition, like looking into a mirror that showed you things you'd forgotten about yourself. The coffee was the last of what I had, French vanilla, bought 3 weeks ago when I still believed my disability check might stretch far enough to cover both food and utilities. Now the electricity would be next, then the water. I'd done this dance before, back when Robert was dying and the medical bills ate through our savings like cancer ate through his lungs. But this time felt different, final. "You have kind eyes," the stranger said, his voice carrying an accent I couldn't place. Not foreign, but from somewhere else, somewhere that existed in the spaces between words. That's rare these days. I wanted to laugh. Kind eyes? These eyes had watched my husband waste away while I counted pills and rationed morphine. These eyes had read the foreclosure notice 17 times, looking for loopholes that didn't exist. These eyes had watched my own children drive away after Robert's funeral, their relief so obvious it made my chest ache for days. "Kindness is expensive," I said, surprised by the bitterness in my own voice. "I can't afford much of it anymore." He smiled then, and something cold settled in my stomach. His teeth were perfect, too perfect for someone who'd been walking the streets all night. No coffee stains, no chips, no signs of a hard life. They reminded me of something, but the memory danced just out of reach, like trying to catch smoke with bare hands. The silence stretched between us, broken only by the ancient refrigerator's death rattle and the sound of sleet against the windows. Outside, Detroit was waking up to another gray December day, but inside this kitchen, time felt suspended, waiting. "What's your name?" I asked, though part of me didn't want to know. "Does it matter?" He leaned forward, and I caught a scent that didn't belong, expensive cologne mixed with something else, something that reminded me of hospitals and empty churches. Names are just words we use to pretend we know each other. But you and I, Margaret, we understand each other already. The way he said my name made my blood freeze. I hadn't told him my name. My hands trembled as I set down my own mug, coffee sloshing over the rim onto the scarred wooden table. The stranger, I refused to think of him as anything else until he earned a name, watched the brown liquid spread across the surface like he was reading tea leaves. His composure unsettled me more than his mysterious knowledge of my identity. "You're wondering how I know you," he said, not looking up from the coffee stain. "The answer is simpler than you think, and more complicated than you'll want to believe." I thought about Robert's last words, whispered through oxygen tubes and morphine haze. "Maggie, promise me you won't give up. Promise me you'll fight." The memory felt like swallowing glass. Fighting required strength I'd lost somewhere between his first seizure and the final bill from hospice care. "I've lived in this house for 47 years, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "Raised 3 children, buried a husband, watched the neighborhood die around me. You want to know something simple? I don't have mysterious strangers knocking on my door unless they're repo men or missionaries. Which are you?" He laughed, a sound like silver bells with the clappers removed, beautiful but hollow. "Neither. I'm something else entirely." The kitchen suddenly felt smaller, the walls pressing closer. I could smell the mold growing behind the peeling wallpaper, could hear mice scratching inside the walls. This house was dying, just like everything else I'd ever loved, one rotting piece at a time. "My daughter called me 3 weeks ago," I found myself saying, though I hadn't planned to share anything personal. First time in months. Want to know what she said? The stranger nodded, though his expression suggested he already knew. She said maybe it was time to consider assisted living, said the house was too much for me now. The words tasted like ash. Sarah had used her concerned daughter voice, the one she'd perfected during Robert's illness. But underneath the worry, I'd heard something else. Calculation. The sound of someone measuring inheritance against obligation and finding the math lacking. "Children often disappoint us," the stranger said softly. "But then again, we often disappoint them too. The question is whether forgiveness is possible, or if some wounds are meant to stay open." His words hit too close to home, like he'd been listening to my 3 a.m. conversations with the empty house. I stood abruptly, chair scraping against linoleum, suddenly desperate to put distance between us. But there was nowhere to go in the tiny kitchen, nowhere to hide from those knowing eyes or the truth they seemed to reflect. Outside, the world continued its relentless December march toward Christmas, a holiday that would find me alone for the first time in my adult life. The stranger's eyes followed my restless pacing, and I felt like a caged animal performing for an audience of one. Every step revealed another humiliation. The torn linoleum I couldn't afford to replace, the cabinet door hanging by one hinge, the window I'd covered with cardboard when the glass cracked last winter. Poverty has its own smell, and it was filling the room like poison gas. "Sit down, Margaret." His voice carried an authority that made my knees weak. "We have things to discuss." I wanted to refuse, to assert some control over my own kitchen, but exhaustion won. I'd been fighting losing battles for so long that surrender felt almost like relief. The chair creaked under my weight. Another thing breaking down, another reminder of my failure to maintain what Robert had worked so hard to provide. "You want to know why I'm here," he continued, pulling something from his coat pocket. A business card, pristine white with raised lettering that caught the weak morning light. "The answer is in what you did 40 years ago. What you've spent 4 decades trying to forget." My blood turned to ice water. There were things buried so deep, I'd convinced myself they'd never happened. Shadows that only visited me in dreams I pretended to forget upon waking. But the way he said it, like he'd been there, like he'd witnessed everything, made my vision blur around the edges. "I don't know what you're talking about," I whispered, but even I could hear the lie in my voice. He placed the card on the table between us, and I saw it wasn't a business card at all. It was a photograph, black and white, the edges yellow with age. A young woman's face stared back at me. My face, decades younger, but wearing an expression I'd tried to forget. The expression of someone who'd made a choice that haunted every quiet moment since. "November 15th, 1983, he said quietly. "St. Mary's Hospital, 2:47 in the morning." The kitchen spun around me. I gripped the table edge until my knuckles went white, but still felt like I was falling through space and time. November 15th, the date that divided my life into before and after, the night that taught me some doors, once opened, could never be closed again. I started, then stopped. There was no point in denying what we both knew. That was a long time ago. 40 years, 3 months, and 18 days, he said with terrifying precision. But some debts don't diminish with time, Margaret. Some promises are forever. I thought about running then, about grabbing my coat and fleeing into the December cold. But where would I go? This house was all I had left. And somehow I knew that even if I ran to the ends of the earth, this conversation would be waiting for me. What would you do if someone appeared at your door with proof of the worst thing you'd ever done, the thing you thought was buried forever? The photograph seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat, drawing my eyes back again and again to that young woman's face, my face, twisted with pain and desperation I'd spent 40 years trying to forget. The stranger sat perfectly still, watching me remember, watching me break apart piece by piece like ice under spring sun. "Tell me what happened that night," he said, though his tone suggested he already knew every detail. I closed my eyes, and suddenly I was 23 again, alone in that hospital corridor that smelled like disinfectant and broken dreams. Robert and I had been married 2 years, trying for a baby for 18 months. We'd saved every penny for fertility treatments, pawned our wedding rings, borrowed against our future. And then, finally, miraculously, I was pregnant. "The bleeding started at 36 weeks, I heard myself saying, my voice coming from somewhere far away. They said there were complications, said the baby might not. I stopped, unable to finish the sentence even now. The memory unfolded like a nightmare I'd lived 1,000 times. The emergency surgery, the machines beeping their urgent warnings, the doctor's grave face as he explained the choice I had to make: save myself or save the baby. There wasn't enough time or resources for both. But that's not the whole story, is it? The stranger leaned forward, his presence suddenly oppressive. Tell me about the other woman. My eyes snapped open. How could you possibly know about... Tell me. The words came out in a rush, like vomit I couldn't control. She was in the bed next to mine, Maria Santos, 17 years old, no insurance, no family. She was having the same complications, but she was further along. The baby was viable. I could still see her face, so young and terrified, clutching my hand as the contractions tore through her small body. The doctors were focused on me, the paying patient, the one with insurance and a husband making demands in the hallway. Maria was an afterthought, a problem for the county hospital to solve later. You made a choice that night, the stranger said softly. I gave her my place in surgery. The confession felt like swallowing razor blades. My baby died while Maria's lived. I told the doctors to save her child instead of mine. But that wasn't the end of it. That wasn't the part that woke me up screaming some nights. The part I'd never told anyone, not even Robert. What else, Margaret? I watched her die. The words came out as a whisper. After the surgery, she hemorrhaged. I held her hand while she bled out, and I promised her. I stopped, my throat closing around the words. You promised her what? That I'd take care of her son, that I'd make sure he was okay. Tears were streaming down my face now, 40 years of guilt pouring out like a broken dam. The stranger smiled that terrible, perfect smile. His name, he said quietly, was Gabriel Santos. And Margaret, he reached across the table and touched my hand. His skin was warm, impossibly warm. I've been looking for you for a very long time. The kitchen tilted on its axis. Gabriel Santos, the name I'd buried so deep I'd almost convinced myself it was a dream, a fever-induced hallucination from the worst night of my life. But here he was, 40 years later, sitting at my scarred wooden table with his mother's eyes and his own impossible agenda. You can't be, I whispered, though every instinct told me it was true. You can't be him. Can't I? He tilted his head, and I saw Maria in the gesture, the same confused curiosity she'd had when the pain medication made her thoughts fuzzy. What did you think happened to that baby, Margaret? Did you think he just disappeared into the system and never wondered about the woman who held his dying mother's hand? My chest felt like it was caving in. This man, this successful, well-dressed man with his expensive coat and perfect teeth, was the child I'd helped save at the cost of my own, the boy I'd promised to love and then abandoned to the mercy of strangers. I looked for you, I lied, then immediately hated myself for it. I tried to find you, but the records were sealed and... Stop. His voice cut through my excuses like a blade. We both know that's not true. You went home to your husband, told him the baby died in surgery, and never mentioned my mother or me again. You let him comfort you for a loss that wasn't even yours, while a motherless infant was handed over to state care. Each word was a physical blow. I could see Robert's face the night I came home from the hospital, the way he'd held me while I cried tears that were equal parts grief and guilt. He'd never known about the choice I'd made, never known that somewhere in the city was a child who existed because our child didn't. The foster system wasn't kind to me, Gabriel continued, his voice matter-of-fact, but his eyes burning with something darker. 17 homes in 18 years, some better than others, some... He paused, rolling up his sleeve to reveal a network of old scars along his forearm. I wanted to look away but couldn't. Each scar was an accusation, a reminder of the promise I'd broken. Gabriel, I aged out at 18 with nothing but the clothes on my back and a manila folder with my mother's name on it. It took me 15 years to track down what happened that night, to find out about the woman who'd been there when she died. The successful businessman facade was cracking, revealing the wounded child underneath. I could see him now, scared, alone, bounced between homes where he was either ignored or abused, carrying the weight of a mother's death he was too young to understand. "I built everything myself," he said, his voice growing stronger. "Every dollar, every connection, every opportunity. I became successful not despite the system failing me, but because I refused to let it define me." And through it all, I remembered her last words. What words? His smile was like broken glass. She said, "The kind lady promised to take care of you. Even dying, even in agony, she believed you'd keep your word." How do you face someone whose entire life was shaped by a promise you broke when they needed you most? Gabriel's revelation hung in the air between us like smoke from a house fire. You can see it, smell it, but you can't escape it. I stared at this man who'd grown from the baby I'd helped save into someone I didn't recognize, someone hardened by a lifetime of disappointments I'd helped create. "What do you want from me?" The question came out smaller than I intended, barely above a whisper. "What I've always wanted," he said, reaching into his coat again. This time he pulled out a leather checkbook, expensive and well-worn, to finish what was started that night. He began writing, the pen scratching against paper in steady, deliberate strokes. The sound seemed impossibly loud in the quiet kitchen, each movement calculated and final. When he tore the check from the book and slid it across the table, I couldn't bring myself to look at it immediately. "This is what 40 years of guilt looks like," he said softly. $67,432, the exact amount you owe on this house, plus late fees, plus interest. The numbers swam before my eyes. My mortgage, paid in full. The foreclosure notice that had been eating at my soul for months, suddenly meaningless. I should have felt relief, gratitude, something approaching joy. Instead, I felt terrified. "Why?" I managed. "Because my mother died believing you were a good person. Because she spent her last moments on earth comforted by the idea that someone cared enough to help a stranger. Because in 40 years of disappointment and betrayal and learning that most people are fundamentally selfish, I've held on to the hope that she was right about you." He stood up, his presence suddenly overwhelming in the small space. I could smell that strange scent again, expensive cologne mixing with something that reminded me of hospital corridors and Sunday mornings in empty churches. "I've spent 2 decades building a fortune, Margaret, made more money than I'll ever spend, acquired more power than I ever wanted, but none of it meant anything because it was all built on the foundation of a broken promise, your broken promise." The check lay between us like a bridge I was afraid to cross. Taking it would mean accepting something I didn't deserve, acknowledging a debt I could never repay. But not taking it would mean losing the only home I'd ever known, the place where Robert's memory still lived in every creaking floorboard and faded photograph. "There's a catch," I said, because there always was. Nothing in life came without strings, especially not miracles. Gabriel's smile was sad and knowing. "The catch is that you have to decide whether you're the woman my mother thought you were or the woman you've been telling yourself you are for 40 years. The catch is that accepting this money means accepting responsibility for what happens next." "What happens next?" He moved toward the door, his expensive shoes silent on the worn linoleum. "That depends entirely on what kind of person you choose to be from this moment forward. My mother believed in redemption, Margaret. The question is whether you do." His hand was on the doorknob when I finally found my voice. "Gabriel, wait, I need to ask you something." He turned back, and in the morning light streaming through the window, I could see Maria's face more clearly than ever in his features. The same delicate bone structure, the same expressive eyes that seemed to hold more sadness than any person should carry. Ask, "Do you forgive me?" Gabriel's hand froze on the doorknob. For a long moment, he didn't turn around, and I could see his shoulders tense beneath the expensive fabric of his coat. When he finally faced me again, his expression was unreadable. Not angry, not kind, just empty in a way that broke my heart. "Forgiveness," he repeated, as if testing the weight of the word. "Do you know what I used to dream about when I was 8 years old and sleeping on a mattress that smelled like other people's nightmares?" I shook my head, afraid to speak. "I used to dream that you'd come for me. I'd close my eyes and imagine this woman with kind hands and a gentle voice showing up at whatever foster home I was rotting in that month, saying she'd made a mistake, saying she was ready to keep her promise." His voice was steady, but I could see the child he'd been flickering behind his adult composure. I held on to that fantasy for years. The check on the table felt like it was burning a hole through the wood. $67,000, more money than I'd seen in my entire life, and it meant nothing compared to the weight of his words. "When did you stop believing I'd come?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. 13. That's when I ended up with the Hendersons. He walked back to the table but didn't sit down. They seemed nice at first, had 4 other foster kids, talked about giving us a real family experience. But Mr. Henderson had very specific ideas about discipline. He rolled up his other sleeve, revealing more scars, these ones more deliberate, more systematic. That's when I learned that promises are just words people use to make themselves feel better about the harm they cause. That's when I stopped being a child and started planning my escape. Each revelation was like a physical blow. This man had survived horrors I couldn't imagine, had built himself into someone successful and powerful despite a system that had failed him at every turn. And through it all, he'd carried the memory of a promise I'd made to his dying mother. "The money isn't about forgiveness," he continued. "It's about something more complicated than that. It's about choices and consequences and the way one night can ripple through decades in ways we never expect." He pulled out another photograph, this one more recent. A small house with a neat yard and a tire swing hanging from an old oak tree. "This is where I grew up. Not literally, I was moved around too much for that. But this is the house I bought last year, in the neighborhood where my mother lived before everything went wrong. It's beautiful," I said. "I've been restoring it, room by room, making it into the home she never got to see me have. And you know what I realized while I was painting the kitchen last month?" I waited. "I realized I was painting it for her, not for me. Still trying to make her proud, still trying to prove I was worth the choice you made that night." He folded the photograph carefully and put it back in his pocket. "That's when I decided to find you." "To punish me?" "To understand." He looked directly at me then, and I saw Maria's capacity for hope still there, buried under years of disappointment, but not destroyed. To see if the woman my mother trusted with her last breath was someone worth trusting. The silence stretched between us, heavy with 40 years of misconnections and broken promises. Outside, the world continued its indifferent rotation, but inside this kitchen, time felt suspended again. "So," I said finally, "what's your verdict?" Gabriel moved to the window, his silhouette dark against the gray December morning. I could hear children somewhere in the distance, their voices thin and bright in the cold air, getting ready for school in houses where the heat still worked and the light stayed on. Normal lives, continuing their normal patterns, while my entire world rearranged itself around this stranger who wasn't a stranger at all. "There's more," he said without turning around. "The money comes with conditions." Of course it did. Nothing was ever free, especially not salvation. I picked up the check again, running my finger along its edges like I could read its secrets through touch. The numbers were real. I checked 3 times, but they felt like fiction, like something that would disappear if I examined them too closely. "Tell me." He turned back to me, and I was struck again by how much he looked like his mother. Maria had had the same way of holding her shoulders when she was preparing to say something difficult, the same slight tilt of her head that suggested she was listening to voices I couldn't hear. "I want you to come with me to her grave." The simple request hit me like cold water. In 40 years, I'd never visited Maria's grave. I'd never even found out where she was buried. I'd convinced myself it was better that way, that some ghosts were meant to stay buried. But looking at Gabriel now, I realized how cowardly that had been. "Where is she?" "Woodlawn Cemetery, Section C, Plot 247. No headstone when I found her 5 years ago, just a concrete marker with a number. I had a proper stone made." His voice grew softer. "She deserved better than being forgotten." The guilt was a living thing now, clawing at my chest and making it hard to breathe. "What does it say? The headstone?" "Maria Santos, beloved mother. She died believing in the goodness of strangers." He paused, and I saw his hands tremble slightly before he clasped them behind his back. "I thought you should know that someone remembered her." I stood up on unsteady legs, feeling every one of my 73 years settling into my bones. "When?" "Today. Now, before you have time to change your mind or convince yourself you don't deserve forgiveness." He reached into his pocket again and pulled out car keys. "I'll drive." The practicality of it struck me as absurd. I was wearing my oldest housecoat, my hair was uncombed, and I hadn't put on real shoes in 3 days. But Gabriel was right. If I had time to think about it, I'd find reasons to say no. I'd spent 40 years perfecting the art of avoiding uncomfortable truths. "I need to get dressed." 5 minutes, he said. "Any longer and you'll lose your nerve." He was right about that too. I was already feeling the familiar urge to retreat, to slam the door and pretend this conversation had never happened. But the check in my hand anchored me to reality, to the impossible possibility that redemption might actually exist. I made it to my bedroom in record time, throwing on the first clean clothes I could find. In the mirror, I looked exactly like what I was, a broken-down old woman who'd spent 40 years running from her past. But maybe that was okay. Maybe Gabriel didn't need me to be anything other than what I was. When I returned to the kitchen, he was standing exactly where I'd left him, patient as a saint. "Ready?" "No," I said honestly, "but let's go anyway." The drive to Woodlawn Cemetery passed in silence that felt both comfortable and terrifying. Gabriel drove with the same careful precision he seemed to apply to everything else, hands at 10 and 2, checking mirrors, following every traffic law to the letter. I watched Detroit scroll past the passenger window, block after block of abandoned houses and overgrown lots that looked like broken teeth in a skull. This city had died around us while we weren't paying attention, just like so many other things. Section C was on a small hill overlooking the freeway, where the constant rush of traffic created a steady hum that felt like the city's pulse. Gabriel parked beneath a massive oak tree whose bare branches created intricate shadows on the frost-covered ground. December in Michigan was all gray skies and bitter wind, but somehow it felt appropriate. Some conversations were meant to happen in winter. "That's her," Gabriel said quietly, pointing to a modest gray headstone about 50 yards away. My legs felt like water, but I forced myself to walk. Each step felt significant, like crossing a bridge I'd been avoiding for 4 decades. The headstone was beautiful, simple granite with an elegant script that must have cost him thousands of dollars. Maria Santos, 1966-1983, beloved mother. She died believing in the goodness of strangers. I come here every year on her birthday, Gabriel said, pulling 2 folding chairs from the trunk of his car. November 3rd, she would have been 57 this year. The math hit me like a slap. Maria had been younger than my youngest grandson was now. A child herself, really, trying to navigate impossible circumstances without anyone to help her. Except me. I was supposed to help her. Tell me about her, I said, settling into the chair Gabriel had placed beside the grave. What was she like before? She was studying to be a teacher, had a partial scholarship to Wayne State before she got pregnant. Her mother kicked her out when she started showing. Very religious family, very disappointed daughter. Gabriel's voice was matter-of-fact, but I could hear the pain underneath. She was living in a studio apartment above a bakery, working nights cleaning offices to pay rent. I closed my eyes and let myself remember that night more clearly than I had in years. Maria's hand in mine, surprisingly strong for someone so young. The way she talked about her baby, even through the pain, making plans for a future she wouldn't live to see. She told me she'd already picked out a name, I said suddenly. Gabriel. She said it meant God's messenger, and she hoped you'd bring good news into the world. He was quiet for a long moment, and when I looked over, there were tears running down his cheeks. She never got to tell me that. She also said she hoped you'd be kind. That was important to her, that you'd grow up to be someone who helped people instead of hurting them. I reached over and touched his hand, surprised by how warm it was despite the cold. I think she would be proud of what you became. Even though I'm here demanding payment for her death? You're not demanding payment, you're offering redemption. The words came out more certainly than I felt them. There's a difference. Gabriel stood up and walked to the headstone, placing his hand on the cold granite. I used to hate you, Margaret. For years, I carried this anger that felt like poison in my blood. I blamed you for every bad thing that happened to me, every disappointment, every moment when the world proved it didn't care about abandoned children. You had every right to hate me. But if hatred is exhausting, and it wasn't getting me what I really wanted. He turned back to me, and I saw Maria's hope still burning in his eyes. What I wanted was to understand why someone would make a promise to a dying girl and then break it. I wanted to know if you ever thought about us, if you ever wondered what happened to the baby you helped save. The truth felt like swallowing broken glass. Every day, every single day for 40 years, I wondered. Standing in that cemetery with Maria's son beside her grave, I felt the weight of 40 years lifting from my shoulders like snow melting in spring sun. The constant ache that had lived in my chest since that November night finally had a name, finally had a face, finally had a chance at resolution. I need to tell you something, I said, my voice stronger than it had been in years, about the promise I made to your mother. Gabriel nodded, still touching the headstone like he was drawing strength from the cold granite. I didn't just promise to take care of you, I continued, the words coming easier now that I'd started. I promised her something else, something I've never told anyone. In those final moments, when she was bleeding out and the machines were screaming and the doctors had given up, she squeezed my hand and made me swear something. The December wind picked up, rattling the bare branches above us and scattering dead leaves across the graves. Gabriel waited, patient as winter itself. She made me promise that if I ever had the chance to help another mother, any mother, I wouldn't hesitate. She said that was how her death could mean something, how her sacrifice could ripple outward and create good in the world. I wiped my eyes with the back of my hand. She died believing that kindness multiplies, that one act of grace can spark another. Gabriel's expression softened. And did you keep that promise? No. The confession felt like absolution. I was too broken by my own loss, too consumed by guilt to see opportunities for kindness. I became selfish, bitter, focused on my own pain instead of ways I could ease someone else's. I stood up, my arthritic knees protesting, but my spirit suddenly lighter. Until today. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the check, holding it between us like a covenant. I'm not keeping this money. Margaret, let me finish. My voice carried an authority I hadn't felt in decades. Your mother didn't die so I could save my house. She died believing that love was stronger than loss, that sacrifice could transform strangers into family. This money, your success, your generosity, it's not payment for a debt. It's seed money for the promise I should have kept 40 years ago. Gabriel stared at me, and I saw understanding dawning in his features. What are you saying? I'm saying Maria's house is going to exist. A place for pregnant teenagers with nowhere else to go, where they can get medical care and emotional support, and someone who believes their babies are worth saving. The vision was crystallizing as I spoke, becoming more real with every word. Your mother's legacy isn't going to be tragedy, it's going to be hope. For the first time since he'd knocked on my door, Gabriel smiled, really smiled, with joy instead of bitter knowledge. "Shall you help me?" I asked. "Will you help me build something that honors what she believed about human goodness?" He pulled me into a hug that felt like coming home after a lifetime of wandering. "Yes," he whispered against my hair. "Yes, we'll build it together." Standing there in that cemetery, holding each other while the wind carried away 4 decades of guilt and regret, I finally understood what Maria had been trying to tell me that night. Love doesn't die with the body. Kindness doesn't end with tragedy. Sometimes the most broken people are exactly the ones equipped to heal the world, because they know what it means to need saving. 6 months later, Maria's house opened its doors to its first resident, a 16-year-old girl named Hope, who reminded me so much of Maria that I had to sit down the first time I saw her smile. Gabriel and I worked side by side every day, turning his mother's death into a celebration of life, her loss into countless gains for others. And sometimes, late at night when I'm alone in my house, the house that's truly mine now, debt-free and filled with purpose, I swear I can feel Maria's presence, warm and approving. The kind lady finally kept her promise, and grace multiplied beyond anything we could have imagined. If this story touched your heart, if you believe that broken promises can be redeemed and that love really is stronger than loss, please hit that like button and share your own stories of unexpected redemption in the comments below. And subscribe to hear more stories about the way grace appears in our lives when we need it most, often wearing the face of a stranger who isn't really a stranger at all. Because sometimes the people who hurt us most are exactly the ones meant to heal us. And sometimes 40 years isn't too late for a promise to bloom into something beautiful.